I read a lot of books and I have even more. One reason I have so many books is because when I read a book and I really like it, I like to hold on to it so that I can revisit it. I can say hi again. And I told a friend this and she was sort of like mystified by this because when she said when she reads a book, she is done. But I like to keep them around, and there are some books that I will go back to again and again. Maybe there's a passage or a story or an essay in there that I really like. For example, Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed. I literally keep this book by my bedside just because there's so many essays and stories in here that I love. It is a book of essays basically disguised as a book of advice columns. And they're so brilliantly and lovingly written that I think if you're going through a dark time or just need some like thoughts about life, this is a great book to turn to. I got it when I was going through a really dark time in life, and I've given this book to, I think, like copies of this book to like half a dozen people. But yeah, this is a book that I will turn to again and again. I actually did that recently with Carmen Maria Machado's Her Body and Other Parties. I loved this book when I first read it in like 2020, and I was thinking of one of the short stories inventory, so I went and pulled this out so that I could reread that. But anyways, that's sort of what I do a lot with books that like mean something to me, is that there will be a passage or something that I want to revisit, and having them on hand helps me do that. But there are a few books that I actually will reread in their entirety. And that's what I wanted to talk about today, because in talking about them, I feel like there are a few like trends or like reasons I will reread a book. So we have On the Road by Jack Kerouac. And I originally read this in high school, and I liked it. I was definitely like sort of a wannabe beatnik type kid, like very, brooding and literary. So of course I was drawn to this book, and there were a lot of things I liked about it. And then it just so happened a couple of years ago, I went on a road trip from Alabama to Portland, and I sort of inadvertently recreated some of the main character's trip, especially like going through Nebraska and Wyoming and sort of that part of the country. We both even stayed in like this random town in Nebraska, Gothenburg. And so it was interesting rereading it from that perspective. And I think that is one of the ways or reasons it's interesting to reread a book, is you gain new knowledge, as time goes on. So now I have a more like intimate perspective to the places in this book, and it gave me more insight to reading it. It was interesting to reread it as an adult and thinking about traveling and comparing our stories, because he's obviously like a white man in the, I think, 1930s traveling, and I am a Black woman in the 2020s traveling, and how different our stories are. He talks about being able to get a hot meal for like $1, and also like hitchhiking and things that I cannot relate to. It's very interesting to like revisit things with new knowledge, new experiences, and be able to compare. One of the reasons I might reread a book is just like pure comfort. The same reason I might rewatch one of my favorite TV shows or movies, or listen to a favorite song you like. It's just like It's comfortable, you know it. It excites you in the same way every time. It hits every time. One of those for me is Agatha Christie, The Tuesday Club Murders. I'm a big Agatha Christie fan. I'm especially a big fan of Miss Marple. She's my favorite of her detectives. Don't tell Parker Pine, who's also an Agatha Christie detective, and my dog, in case you don't know. But yeah, this is a collection of short stories featuring Miss Jane Marple, the elderly amateur sleuth. And they're so comforting. They are peak Agatha Christie. They are exactly what you think of when you think of a cozy British murder mystery, where it is some rich people at a dining room table going over crimes that they've heard about. So just easy to dive in, and even though I know the endings, it's wonderful just to read the mystery and like see her be an expert. So I talked, I think a couple videos ago, about Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I originally read this book because I was looking to join a new book club, and this was the book they were reading. I knew nothing about it. I just got it from the library, read it, loved it. Mind-blowing, life-changing, all that. Actually got to meet Min Jin Lee in Seattle like a year after I read the book, and I was fawning over her, and she was so incredibly kind. This book is a multi-generational family story about a Korean family that is living in Japan through the 1930s to the 1980s. And the main character is a woman named Sunja. We see her grow from basically birth to her 80s. And I really love this book. The first time I read it, I think the relationship between mother and daughter really stood out to me. Sunja and her mother had a really beautiful but fraught and complicated relationship, especially as her mother began to age. And then I was thinking about it last year, and there was a passage I was trying to remember, and I looked it up. And lo and behold, I ended up reading the entire book again. And it's a whopper. It's 500 pages. But I think what is interesting is that this book encompasses so much. There's motherhood and love and heartbreak and war and oppression. And there's just so much to get from this book that rereading it this time, I was much more interested, or what stuck with me most was the stories of war and how that affects families over generations, and how we are still seeing those things today. I feel like this is a book I could return to again and again, because it's written so beautifully and it's easy to read, but also there's so many themes that you might want to come back and you're going to pick up something new every time. Something I read when I was really young that I've returned to either singular essays, or to reread the whole thing because I just think it's a brilliant book, is Chuck Klosterman's Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. This book was life-changing to me. It was so funny, just so irreverent, and talked about pop culture in this really serious way that I had never read before. He's still one of my favorite writers. I think I have at least 80% of his books. I'm not gonna say I have all of them because I still haven't read the 90s, which is an abomination. But I really love this book, and it's one of those books it's almost like a foundational text to me and my personality. And so every few years I will go back and reread it, and I will see how much I have changed from this book, how much my understanding of life, just through becoming an adult, I am now older than Klosterman was when he wrote this. And I have different takes on some of the things that he says. And also it's very interesting with a book like this specifically to see how our perception of different cultural and historical and political figures have changed over time. This book was originally published, I believe, in 2002. And it talks about Kid Rock and Woody Allen and Charlie Rose and just all sorts of people that over the past 20 years or so, our ideas and knowledge of them and perception of them have shifted dramatically. And I think what's interesting is a lot of times it's already there. Like the things that we think about them later, they are already like, you're seeing those things start to come together 20 years before. And I think Chuck Klosterman is really like astute. But yeah, I think this is a book that I come back to as like almost a historical text of this specific moment in pop culture history. Nostalgia is a reason to end up rereading books. I read this, The Day the Music Died by Ed Gorman, when I was 10, which was definitely too young to read this book. It is set the day the music died, February 3rd, 1959, and that is a reference to when Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper were in a plane crash and all sadly died. It was the first major rock and roll tragedy and sort of like a major cultural defining moment. The main character of this is a private detective in a small town in Iowa, and he's deeply moved by the tragedy, and then he gets pulled into a murder. And it is very typical, like noir, like, femme fatales, seedy elements, a disgruntled detective. And yeah, I read it when I was 10. I read it from cover to cover, and it was in my school's library, weirdly, which probably should not have been. But anyway, like decades later, I discover it in a library book sale, and I think I'd almost like thought it was a fever dream of a book that I'd like just made up. And so I had to get it, and I reread it. And I think what was interesting is, like I said, it's very much like a noir novel. Is this book the reason I got so into mystery stuff as an adult? It was interesting to read these things and like understand them as an adult, like what was happening in this book, because there's definitely like some darker elements. It was definitely like sort of saying hi to a younger version of myself that was like curious and thought, there was something in this book that appealed to me at that age that still appeals to me now. And so it's sort of cool to like say hi to my younger self in that way. So yeah, so those are just a few books that I, have reread in its entirety. I've talked to different people about like rereading books, and some people look at me like I have two heads. Other readers are like, oh, absolutely. Where do you stand on this? Do you think, is that something you do, rereading entire books, or keeping them to like reread certain passages? Are there any books you absolutely would not reread again?